The hum of conversation, the rustling of carry-on bags, and the occasional clink of a coffee cup filled the air as passengers settled into their seats on Flight 307. The first-class cabin, with its plush leather seats and spacious legroom, exuded an air of quiet exclusivity. The scent of fresh linen mingled with the faint aroma of brewed espresso, a subtle luxury that most passengers in this section took for granted. As the last few travelers stowed their luggage, a woman in a navy blue blazer and cream slacks entered with quiet elegance. Sophia Ellis, composed and self-assured, made her way to seat 3A, a window seat near the front of the first-class cabin. She moved with the kind of grace that turned heads, not because of extravagance or fame, but because of the unspoken confidence that surrounded her like an invisible shield. As she reached her seat, she carefully placed her leather handbag in the overhead compartment, smoothing out her blazer before taking her seat. She exhaled softly, allowing herself a moment to sink into the comfort of the seat. This wasn't an unfamiliar setting for her. She had traveled extensively for work, attending international conferences, speaking at panels, and navigating business deals with the same poised professionalism she carried in her everyday life. But today, something felt different. A few moments later, as the last passengers filed in and the flight attendants performed their final checks, a woman in a crisp uniform approached. Rachel Hunter, one of the lead attendants for the flight, carried a clipboard in one hand, a pen poised between her fingers. She was efficient, focused, and prided herself on ensuring the smoothest possible flight experience. But as her eyes flickered towards Sophia, a subtle crease formed between her brows. Rachel hesitated only for a moment before stepping forward, her professional smile fixed in place. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said in a tone that was polite but carried a distinct undertone of authority. "Could I see your boarding pass, please?" Sophia looked up, momentarily surprised, but reached into her blazer pocket without hesitation, retrieving the small paper ticket. She handed it to Rachel with a faint smile, waiting as the flight attendant scanned the details. Rachel's eyes darted over the ticket, and a flicker of something unreadable crossed her face. "It looks like there's been a mistake," she said smoothly, though her posture stiffened ever so slightly. "This seat is reserved for another passenger. I'll need to move you to a different one." A few passengers in the surrounding rows glanced up, their curiosity piqued. Sophia, however, remained composed, her expression unreadable. "There's no mistake," she replied, her voice calm yet firm. "This is the seat I reserved." Rachel shifted, her fingers tightening slightly around the clipboard. She had dealt with confused passengers before, those who had mistakenly booked economy but believed they deserved an upgrade, or those who had assumed an open seat was up for grabs. But something about the way Sophia spoke, steady, unwavering, awing, unnerved her. Rachel pressed on, keeping her voice measured. "I understand, but we do have a seating issue, and I'd really appreciate your cooperation. There's a seat available toward the back that's just as comfortable." She gestured vaguely toward the rear of the aircraft, where the first-class cabin faded into business and economy. Sophia didn't move. For a moment, silence stretched between them, taut and heavy. There was no outburst, no indignation, just quiet, composed resistance. "I appreciate your concern," she said, her voice smooth as silk, "but I'd prefer to remain in the seat I was assigned." Rachel's cheeks burned. This wasn't how these interactions usually went. Typically, a hesitant nod, a muttered apology, and a passenger would comply without question. But Sophia wasn't arguing. She was simply holding her ground without bending. And that, for some reason, made Rachel uncomfortable. Tension crackled in the air. A few rows ahead, a businessman lowered his phone slightly, pretending not to listen, while a young woman across the aisle glanced between them with wide eyes. The moment was small, yet it carried an unexpected weight, as if something larger was about to unfold. Rachel inhaled sharply, forcing a smile. "I must insist, ma'am," she said, her voice firmer now. "It would really be best if we handle this quickly." For the first time, Sophia's expression flickered, a hint of something that could have been disappointment, or perhaps quiet resolve. She held Rachel's gaze for a long moment before finally moving. With the same unshaken grace that had marked her entrance, Sophia reached for her handbag, unbuckling her seatbelt with a soft click. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply complied, but not in the way Rachel expected. As Sophia stepped into the aisle, gathering her belongings with careful precision, Something in the cabin shifted. Passengers watched her, not as a disruptive traveler, but as a woman who had just been dismissed without cause. A ripple of unease moved through the rows, subtle but unmistakable. As Sophia walked toward the back of the plane, the weight of a dozen silent stares followed her. Not out of pity, but out of curiosity, out of the lingering question that no one dared to voice. Why had she been asked to move? Up front, Rachel exhaled, relief washing over her. She had handled the situation. The issue was resolved, or so she thought. But what Rachel didn't realize, what no one on that plane knew, was that in exactly 4 minutes, everything would change. Because Sophia Ellis wasn't just another passenger. She wasn't just a woman in a tailored blazer with quiet confidence. She was the CEO of the airline, and this flight was about to become an unforgettable lesson. The first-class cabin had settled into a rhythm of quiet luxury, the hushed murmur of conversation, the occasional clink of crystal glasses as champagne was poured, and the low hum of the engines as Flight 307 cruised at 35,000 feet. The tension from earlier, when Sophia Ellis had been quietly asked to move, had dissipated, at least on the surface. Passengers had returned to their routines, flipping through magazines, adjusting their reclining seats, and scrolling absent-mindedly through their devices. But one man had not moved on. Seated near the front, Daniel Carrington appeared every bit the embodiment of quiet power. Impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, his tailored cuffs resting neatly at his wrists, he looked like a man accustomed to control. There was an air of authority in the way he carried himself, his presence alone enough to command attention, even when he remained silent. But at that moment, Daniel wasn't concerned with being noticed. He was watching, calculating. His sharp gaze, hidden behind the faint reflection of his tablet screen, had followed everything. He had seen Rachel's carefully measured smile as she approached Sophia. He had caught the flicker of discomfort on Sophia's face. Not anger, not even surprise, just quiet disappointment. He had seen how she had gathered her things without a fight, moving to the back of the plane as if she were nothing more than an afterthought. And that didn't sit well with him. Daniel was not the kind of man who reacted impulsively. No, he understood the power of silence, the weight of patience. He knew that sometimes the greatest statements were made without raising a voice. And right now, that's exactly what he was doing, waiting. Rachel, meanwhile, had no idea she had made a mistake. The flight attendant was busy moving through the aisles, offering drinks and attending to passengers. The interaction with Sophia had already faded from her mind, chalked up as just another moment in a long shift filled with countless customer interactions. She had handled it. It was over. Or so she thought. Across the aisle, a few passengers still glanced toward the back of the plane where Sophia now sat. They had noticed, even if they didn't fully understand. Some had whispered about it, a few raised eyebrows, a quiet exchange of speculation. But no one had spoken up. No one had challenged what had just happened. No one except Daniel. He didn't move, didn't shift in his seat. He simply waited, biding his time like a storm gathering strength over distant waters. Rachel had just finished serving a glass of water to a passenger when she heard the quiet chime of a service request. She glanced up, her eyes flickering toward the source. Seat 2C, her stomach tightened just slightly. Daniel Carrington. She had noticed him, of course. Everyone noticed him. He wasn't loud, nor did he demand attention, but there was something about him that made people listen when he spoke. Something that made people sit up just a little straighter. She quickly smoothed the front of her uniform, making sure everything was in place before approaching with a polite but professional smile. "How can I assist you, sir?" she asked, keeping her tone neutral. Daniel looked up at her, his expression unreadable. Then, with a measured calm that sent a prickle down Rachel's spine, he gestured toward the seat across from him. The empty one meant for attendants to sit during turbulence. "Sit." Rachel hesitated. That wasn't a request. It was a command. Passengers nearby pretended not to notice, but the shift in the air was palpable. The businessman across the aisle lowered his phone, watching from the corner of his eye. The elderly woman a row behind glanced up from her book, sensing the weight of the moment. Rachel's hands tightened around her notepad, a flicker of confusion crossing her face. "Sir, Daniel didn't move, didn't blink. "I said sit." For a long moment, she didn't move. Then, as if compelled by something unseen, she lowered herself into the seat across from him, her spine rigid, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Silence stretched between them. Then Daniel leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping just enough that only she could hear. Do you know who you just escorted to the back of the plane? Rachel's breath hitched. Her mind raced, searching for an answer she suddenly wished she had known sooner. His voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. That woman you dismissed so easily? That woman you assumed didn't belong in first class? His sharp gaze pinned her to her seat. She's the CEO of this airline. The words struck like a thunderclap. Rachel froze. The noise of the plane, the hum of the engines, the clink of glasses, the soft laughter of passengers, all of it became distant, drowned out by the rush of blood pounding in her ears. CEO. Not just another passenger, not just someone looking for an upgrade, the owner. The woman whose name was printed on the employee handbook she had studied during training. Rachel's mouth went dry. She felt like the air had been sucked from the cabin. She had asked the most powerful woman on this plane to move. A fresh wave of realization crashed over her. The way Sophia had remained calm, unshaken, almost as if she had expected this. Rachel had treated her like she was insignificant, and now there was no undoing it. She tried to find her voice, but it wavered. I didn't know. Daniel tilted his head slightly, considering her. And if you had known? His voice was soft, but his words were razor sharp. Would you have treated her differently? Rachel swallowed, her heart hammering against her ribs. Would she have? The question hung in the air like a judge's final sentence. Daniel leaned back, his expression unreadable once more. That's the problem, he murmured. He let the weight of his words settle over her. Then, without another glance, he pressed the service button on his seat, summoning another flight attendant. Rachel's skin prickled as a younger attendant hurried over. Sir, is there anything I can get you? Daniel gave Rachel one last measured look before turning his attention to the new attendant. Yes, I'd like to speak to the captain. The younger attendant blinked, caught off guard, but nodded quickly. Of course, sir. As she hurried off, Rachel sat frozen in her seat, her stomach twisting into knots. Daniel didn't need to raise his voice, didn't need to cause a scene. His quiet presence alone had just changed everything. And now, as Rachel sat there, staring down at her trembling hands, she realized something far more terrifying than losing her job. She had just become a lesson. The air inside the cabin was still, thick with an unspoken weight that seemed to press down on everything. Flight 307 had been smooth, at least from a technical standpoint, but for one flight attendant, turbulence had arrived in the form of 4 simple words. I'd like to talk. Rachel Hayes, standing at the edge of the first-class cabin, forced a neutral smile. Her uniform was still crisp, her posture still perfect, but inside, something was unraveling. She had spent years perfecting the art of handling high-profile passengers, of navigating difficult interactions without faltering. But this was different. She had made a mistake, a small one she had thought at first, just a routine seat reassignment. But now, as she stood there, facing the man whose piercing stare held a quiet authority, she knew she had miscalculated. Daniel Carrington, the CEO of the airline, had not raised his voice. He had not caused a scene. He simply gestured to the empty seat across from him and said, "Sit." Rachel hesitated, her hands clasped tightly. Passengers in nearby rows pretended not to notice, but their subtle glances betrayed their curiosity. They could sense something important was unfolding, even if they didn't understand exactly what. With measured movements, Rachel lowered herself into the seat. She had no idea what was coming next, but her heart was already hammering in anticipation. Daniel folded his hands in his lap, his voice even, controlled. Tell me something, Rachel. Her breath caught at the sound of her name. Do you remember the woman you asked to move? Rachel's stomach twisted. She had tried to push the incident from her mind, chalking it up as just another seating issue. But now, with Daniel looking at her like a man who already knew the answer, she suddenly felt the full weight of her decision pressing down on her chest. Sir, He held up a hand, cutting her off. Not harshly, but with a finality that made her throat tighten. This wasn't a conversation. This was a reckoning. That woman, he said, his voice calm but firm, is my wife. Rachel froze. A chill ran down her spine. Her fingers dug into the fabric of her skirt as she struggled to process what he had just said. His wife. the CEO's wife, and she had asked her to move to the back of the plane. Daniel let the silence stretch, watching as realization dawned on her face. Rachel's mouth opened, then closed. There was no excuse. No explanation that would fix this. Finally, she forced out a whisper. I didn't know. Daniel nodded slowly. That's the problem. The words sliced through her like a blade. She had built her career on professionalism, on handling passengers fairly and without bias. But in that moment, she saw herself clearly, not as the confident, composed flight attendant she had always strived to be, but as someone who had made an assumption. And she had been wrong. A sharp sound broke the moment, the crackle of the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we regret to inform you that we will be making an emergency landing due to a passenger medical emergency. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts. The cabin shifted immediately. Passengers straightened in their seats, heads turned, whispers spread. Rachel shot to her feet, her training kicking in. A medical emergency? Who? Where? Her question was answered a second later when she spotted a woman in 18B slumped over, her face pale, her breathing shallow. Rachel didn't hesitate. Everything else, the shame, the conversation with Daniel, the weight of her mistake, vanished. This was what she did. This was where she belonged. She rushed toward the woman, assessing her quickly. Ma'am, can you hear me? No response. Rachel's heart pounded. She turned back, scanning the cabin. Is there a doctor on board? A man 2 rows back raised his hand. I'm a cardiologist. Rachel exhaled in relief, stepping back to let him work while another flight attendant grabbed the emergency medical kit. Rachel was right beside them, steadying the woman's trembling hands, offering quiet reassurances even as her pulse spiked with adrenaline. Minutes passed, heavy with tension. The plane began its descent. By the time the wheels touched the runway, the woman's condition had stabilized. Paramedics were already waiting at the gate, ready to take over. Rachel helped lift the woman's oxygen mask as they transferred her onto the stretcher. As the paramedics wheeled her away, she squeezed Rachel's hand and muttered a weak but heartfelt, "Thank you." Rachel barely managed a smile before stepping back, her uniform slightly disheveled, strands of hair slipping loose from her usually perfect bun. Then she turned and locked eyes with Daniel. He had seen everything. He had watched her work, watched as she instinctively put everything aside to do what mattered most, helping someone who needed her. Rachel straightened her shoulders, trying to steady her breath. The passengers disembarked slowly, murmuring about the incident. She knew some of them still remembered what had happened earlier. But now they had seen another side of her too, and somehow that mattered. As the last few passengers left, Rachel made her way toward Daniel, bracing herself. He was still seated in first class, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. She stopped in front of him, her hands clasped tightly, but her voice steady. I was wrong, she admitted softly, about everything. Daniel studied her, then nodded once. I know. The simplicity of it nearly brought tears to her eyes. Rachel cleared her throat. I don't expect forgiveness, sir, but I needed to say it. For the first time, Daniel's expression shifted. The cool detachment softened, just slightly. He exhaled, then gestured toward the door. Walk with me. Rachel hesitated, then nodded. As they stepped into the empty terminal, Daniel glanced at her. I saw what you did back there. Rachel felt her chest tighten. You made a mistake, he continued, but I also saw the kind of person you are when it counts. She swallowed, emotion tightening her throat. Daniel stopped walking, turning toward her. Respect isn't about knowing who someone is, he said. It's about treating everyone like they matter. No exceptions. Rachel nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. I understand that now. Daniel studied her for a long moment. Then to her surprise, he extended a hand. Rachel stared at it, then reached out, shaking it firmly. A second chance. As they parted ways, Rachel knew she had a long road ahead to rebuild trust. But for the first time, she knew she was ready to do the work. The hum of the aircraft's engines filled the cabin, but inside a deeper silence had settled, one heavy with realization. Passengers exchanged quiet glances, their eyes flicking from one another before inevitably drifting toward the woman in the back of the plane. Elena sat with quiet poise, her gaze fixed on the window, her expression unreadable. She hadn't fought. She hadn't raised her voice. She had simply moved when asked, and yet something about her presence refused to be erased. Rachel Hayes, the flight attendant who had insisted she switch seats, felt the weight of it more than anyone. She was used to being in control, to giving orders and expecting compliance without second thought. But now, as she moved through the cabin, the realization of what had happened began to settle uncomfortably in her chest. She had judged Elena the moment she saw her, had assumed something about her, about whether or not she belonged in first class, and she had been wrong. But Elena had never corrected her, never demanded recognition, never protested. She had simply stood, gathered her things, and walked. And in doing so, she had forced the entire plane to confront an uncomfortable truth. Passengers who had watched the exchange with disinterest now found themselves unable to look away. Some whispered among themselves, murmuring their own guilt, their own recognition. A businessman in row 6 adjusted his tie uncomfortably, his fingers tightening on his armrest. A young woman a few rows back bit her lip, staring down at her hands. They all felt it, the silent lesson unfolding before them. Rachel continued her rounds, but her hands trembled slightly as she passed out drinks. She could still feel Elena's presence, even at the back of the plane, and so could someone else. Daniel Carrington, the man who had watched everything unfold from his seat in first class, was now watching Rachel. He had said nothing at the time, had not intervened, had not corrected Rachel's mistake, because he had wanted to see what Elena would do, and what she had done was something he deeply understood. Daniel had spent years in corporate boardrooms, at high-profile meetings, watching people wield power with their voices, with commands, with force. But Elena, she wielded it through silence, through patience, through letting people expose their own failures. Rachel felt his gaze before she saw him move. When she finally glanced up, she saw Daniel rise from his seat, straightening his jacket. He was coming toward her. Rachel's throat tightened as he approached. Every passenger was watching now. She had made a mistake, and she knew it. But the realization of just who Elena was hadn't hit her yet. Not until Daniel stopped right beside her, kiddo. "Sir," Rachel began, forcing a polite, professional smile, as though she could still salvage this moment. But Daniel simply looked past her. His eyes locked on Elena, and then he walked past Rachel without a word. Rachel turned, watching in shock as a man whose presence radiated authority, whose tailored suit and crisp demeanor marked him as someone of importance, slipped into the aisle, walking the length of the plane. He was headed toward the woman she had dismissed. Passengers sat up straighter, craning their necks. No one knew exactly what was happening, but they could feel it. Something was about to shift. Rachel's pulse pounded as she watched Daniel reach Elena's row. He stopped. Passengers held their breath. And then, in one simple, measured movement, Daniel lowered himself into the empty seat beside her. The cabin went silent. Rachel's fingers curled around the tray in her hands, her heart thudding painfully against her ribs. Daniel Carrington, the man who had barely glanced at anyone on this flight, who had been immersed in his work just moments ago, was now sitting beside the woman she had asked to move. Rachel saw it then, the way he turned toward Elena, the familiarity in his posture. And suddenly, it hit her like a shockwave. They knew each other. No, it was more than that. They were together. Rachel's stomach dropped, because if Daniel Carrington, the CEO of the very airline she worked for, was sitting next to Elena with quiet reverence, then who was Elena? Whispers spread like wildfire. People murmured, eyes darting between Elena and Daniel, the unspoken tension in the air thick enough to drown in. Rachel felt her entire body go cold. She had misjudged her. She had misjudged everything. And yet, Elena still said nothing. She didn't gloat. She didn't look toward Rachel with resentment or smugness. She simply turned toward Daniel. Rachel saw the quiet warmth in her eyes as Daniel spoke to her in hushed tones. Whatever he was saying, it was meant only for her. And then, after a long pause, Elena finally spoke. Her voice was soft but clear enough to carry. "It's okay," she said, her words filled with quiet strength. "People learn from their choices." Rachel felt her throat tighten. She had no reason to be forgiven. She had misjudged Elena, had pushed her to the back of the plane without hesitation. And yet, Elena was letting it go. Not because she was weak, but because she understood something Rachel didn't. She understood that sometimes lessons weren't about punishment. Sometimes they were about letting people see themselves clearly. And Rachel did. For the first time in her career, she truly saw herself, and she didn't like what she saw. Daniel turned back toward Rachel, his gaze unreadable. He didn't need to say anything, because Elena had already said everything. Rachel swallowed hard, then nodded. She understood. And as she turned away, back toward the front of the plane, she promised herself something. She would never make this mistake again. Not just because of who Elena was, but because of who she had realized she wanted to be. Rachel stood frozen near the galley, her pulse pounding in her ears, her hands trembling as they gripped the metal edge of the card. Her uniform felt too tight, too stiff, too suffocating. The murmurs of passengers had begun to settle, but the weight of what had happened, of what she had done, had not. She had misjudged Elena, not just misjudged, she had dismissed her. Rachel had looked at the quiet, composed woman and had made an assumption, one cruel assumption, that Elena didn't belong, that she wasn't someone who mattered, that moving her would mean nothing. But now she could feel the weight of her mistake pressing against her chest like an iron fist, because Elena had mattered all along. And the worst part? Rachel had known it the second she looked into her eyes. Even before she knew who Elena truly was, even before Daniel Carrington had walked down that aisle, before he had sat beside Elena, before his mere presence had confirmed the truth, Rachel had already felt it. Something inside her had known that she was making a mistake. But she had done it anyway, and now she had to face the consequences. Rachel swallowed hard. The card in front of her blurred as tears stung her eyes. She had spent years in this job, priding herself on her professionalism, her ability to manage a flight with perfect control. She was efficient, respected, good at her job. But now, for the first time, she wasn't so sure. For the first time, she realized that maybe, just maybe, she had spent all these years doing it wrong. The truth cut through her. It wasn't just about Elena. It was about every moment she had dismissed someone without a second thought. Every time she had assumed she knew their worth just by looking at them. Every time she had used her position to enforce a rule rather than to serve. And the worst part? Elena hadn't demanded anything from her, hadn't exposed her, hadn't embarrassed her. Instead, she had simply let Rachel see herself. And that was so much worse. Rachel forced herself to look up, to push back the shame that threatened to swallow her whole. And that's when she saw Elena again, seated quietly in the back, the same serene expression on her face. Rachel's heart ached. She could ignore this, pretend it was nothing. Move on, finish the flight, go back to life as usual. But deep down she knew she would never forget this. And if she walked away now, she would be proving that she had learned nothing. Her hands curled into fists. She had to face it. Before she could think too hard about it, she forced her feet forward, one step, then another, until she was moving down the aisle. Passengers turned to watch, their gazes burning into her back. But Rachel didn't care. This wasn't for them. This was for her, and for the woman she had wronged. When Rachel reached Elena's row, she stopped, her breath shaky. Elena turned, her deep, calm eyes settling on her, waiting. Rachel hesitated, her throat felt tight. But she couldn't walk away. Rachel's voice caught. Elena waited. Rachel took a breath, steadying herself, and then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said the hardest words she had ever spoken. I was wrong. A hush fell over the nearby rows. Rachel felt her cheeks burn, but she didn't drop her gaze. I judged you. I assumed things about you before I even knew you. I treated you like you didn't matter. Her voice cracked. I am so sorry. Mom, she expected something. Anger, resentment, cold dismissal. But Elena simply studied her, her expression unreadable. And then finally she spoke. It's not about apologies, Rachel. Rachel's stomach dropped. Elena's voice was gentle, but her words cut deeper than any reprimand. It's about what you do next, Elena continued, her voice steady. Apologies are easy, change is hard. Rachel felt her breath hitch, because she knew Elena was right. She could apologize all she wanted, but if she walked away from this moment and went back to being the same person, then what did her apology even mean? Rachel swallowed past the lump in her throat, and then, with quiet determination, she nodded. I want to be better. Elena held her gaze for a long moment, as if measuring the weight of Rachel's words. Then at last she gave the smallest of nods. And just like that, Rachel felt like she could breathe again. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't absolution. But it was a chance, and she would not waste it. Rachel turned and walked back up the aisle. She felt different because this moment, this lesson, was not just about a seat on a plane. It was about who she would choose to be from now on. And for the first time in a long time, Rachel knew exactly what she had to do. Daniel had seen it before. A single mistake, an ugly moment, and then silence. People moved on, the world turned, and nothing changed. He had watched companies bury their problems under weak apologies and empty policies, hoping the world would forget before they had to do anything real. But this time it was his company, his airline. And the woman who had been wronged was his wife. Daniel stood in the executive boardroom, staring at the skyline through the glass wall. The city stretched before him, glittering, moving, oblivious. But his mind was still on that flight, on Rachel's hesitation, on Elena's unwavering poise, and on the truth that gnawed at him. This wasn't just about one flight attendant. Rachel had made an assumption about Elena, yes, but how many others had been silently dismissed over the years? How many passengers had been moved, ignored, belittled, without anyone noticing? How many Elenas had walked off flights feeling less than they were, simply because someone had decided they didn't belong? Daniel's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. Not this time. He turned as the door opened. Elena stepped inside, her expression calm, her presence steady as ever. She had already moved past what had happened to her, but Daniel hadn't. "Elena," he said, his voice measured, "I need your help." She studied him, waiting. "I don't want this to be just another corporate incident," he continued, his jaw tight. "I don't want to issue a standard apology and pretend it's over." Elena nodded, stepping closer. "What do you want?" Daniel exhaled, his gaze searching hers. "A shift," he said simply, "a real one." A small, knowing smile tugged at Elena's lips, and then she nodded. "I'll do it." The next week, Elena walked back into the same airline headquarters. But this time she wasn't a passenger. She was a teacher. She stepped into a crowded training room filled with flight attendants, managers, and staff from every level of the airline. All eyes turned to her, some curious, some nervous. Rachel sat near the back, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had asked to be there. She hadn't been forced. And that, more than anything, made Elena believe she had already begun to change. Elena took a deep breath, then began. "I want to start with a question." Silence. Then she spoke the words that had been burning in her heart. "How many of you have made a mistake that you wish you could take back?" Slowly, hands began to rise. Not just one, many. Rachel hesitated, then lifted hers too. Elena nodded, her expression soft. "Mistakes don't define us," she said. "But what we do after them, that does." The room stilled, because this wasn't some cold corporate training. It was real, and they felt it. Elena continued, her voice steady but filled with meaning. "We all have biases. We all make snap judgments. But what if, just once, before we act, we ask ourselves," she paused, "what if I'm wrong?" Rachel's breath caught, because that was exactly what she hadn't done. She had been so sure, and she had been wrong. Elena's voice wrapped around the room like a quiet force. "Think about the power you hold in those moments. A small action, a tone of voice, a dismissive glance, a decision can change someone's experience entirely." Elena met Rachel's eyes. Rachel felt her chest tighten, because in that moment she realized this wasn't just about passengers. It was about everyone. The tired mother traveling alone. The elderly man trying to navigate an airport too fast for him. The flight attendant struggling through her first week, terrified to ask for help. How many times had Rachel been the reason someone felt small? And how many times had she not even noticed? Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. This was more than just training. This was a reckoning, and it was exactly what she needed. As the months passed, the training spread, from one room to many, from flight attendants to executives. The entire company began to shift. New flight attendants were trained not just in policies, but in humanity. Empathy became part of the job. Rachel became one of the first employees to fully embrace it. She didn't just take the training, she helped lead it. She stood in front of new recruits, sharing her own story, the story of her failure, of the day she assumed, of the day she realized, and of the day she chose to be different. Because that was the thing, wasn't it? Change wasn't about grand gestures. It wasn't about dramatic redemption arcs. It was about what happened in the quiet moments, in the choices no one else saw. The moment Rachel stopped seeing a uniform and started seeing a person. The moment a flight attendant paused before rolling their eyes at a frustrated passenger and chose patience instead. The moment a gate agent didn't dismiss someone, but instead said, "How can I help?" Small choices, small moments, but they added up, and they changed everything. Elena never imagined she would stand here, in front of a room full of people, some watching her with curiosity, others with uncertainty, and a few with quiet skepticism. She wasn't a public speaker. She wasn't an executive. She was just a woman who had once been dismissed. And yet, here she was, because she knew something now. Change didn't happen in boardrooms filled with statistics and graphs. It happened here, face to face, heart to heart, where people had the chance to truly listen. Elena took a slow breath, letting the weight of the moment settle before she spoke. "I never expected to be here," she admitted, her voice even. "I never expected to be part of this conversation. But sometimes life places you in a moment you didn't ask for. And in that moment, you have a choice to stay silent or to speak." The room was silent, not because people weren't interested, but because they were feeling it. She saw it in their faces. The young flight attendant sitting near the front, her lips pressed together. The older executive in the corner, his fingers drumming against his knee. And then, Rachel, sitting near the back, her hands clasped, her shoulders stiff. Elena held her gaze for a fleeting second before continuing. "I want to tell you a story," she said, her voice warm but steady. "It's a small one, but it's one I haven't been able to forget." A murmur of curiosity passed through the room. "Years ago, I was flying alone. It was a long flight, a red-eye. I was exhausted, but I stayed awake, staring out the window." Her fingers brushed against the podium. A flight attendant stopped beside me. She was smiling, but it didn't reach her eyes. She asked if I wanted a drink. I said no, thank you. Elena let the memory unfold, and then she sighed. A pause. It was soft, barely noticeable, but I noticed. The air in the room shifted because they all knew what she meant. That sigh, that tiny involuntary reaction. It was the unspoken message, the silent dismissal. "She didn't say anything rude," Elena continued. "She didn't need to. That sigh told me everything." Some flight attendants in the room shifted in their seats. Some looked away, because they had been that flight attendant, and they knew it. Elena's voice softened. "I knew I wasn't an important passenger. I wasn't someone she needed to impress. I was just another face in the crowd." She took a slow breath, and that's what stayed with me. Silence. A heavy, thoughtful silence. Because every person in the room had had a moment like that, where they made someone feel small, where they didn't think twice about it, and now they were thinking. Elena let the moment breathe before speaking again. "Fast forward to that flight, the one you all heard about. The tension tightened because they all knew the story, and now they were about to hear it from her. I was asked to move," she said simply. "I was given a reason, a justification, but I wasn't given dignity." Rachel flinched because Elena didn't say her name. She didn't need to. Everyone in the room knew who had done it, and yet Elena's tone wasn't angry. She wasn't standing here to shame Rachel. She was standing here to teach her, to teach all of them. "Now I need you to hear this part carefully." Her gaze swept the room. It wasn't the action that hurt. It was the assumption behind it. She paused. The belief that I didn't belong, that I wasn't worth questioning that assumption for. A lump formed in Rachel's throat because she hadn't questioned it. She had been so certain, and she had been wrong. Elena's voice dropped, softer now. "And I think maybe we've all done that." A ripple went through the room because no one here could claim they hadn't. They had all, at some point, judged too quickly. They had all, at some point, forgotten the weight of their choices. Rachel's hands curled into fists in her lap because this moment, this was her reckoning. And yet, it was also her chance. Elena glanced toward her. Rachel swallowed hard. Then before she lost her nerve, she stood. The entire room turned to watch. Rachel's pulse pounded in her ears, but she held her ground. And then she spoke. "I did that," Rachel said, her voice shaking. "I made that mistake." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some people glanced at her with pity, others with respect. But Elena, she simply nodded, because she knew what it took to say those words. "And I regret it," Rachel continued, "not because I got caught, but because it took being confronted with my own bias to see how deep it ran." Her hands trembled, but she didn't lower them. "I can't take back what I did," Rachel said, her voice breaking slightly. "But I can learn, and I can do better." A heavy pause. Then Elena smiled, soft, understanding, proud. Because this was what she had come here for. Not to make people feel shame, but to help them find change. Elena turned to the rest of the room. "That's all we can ask of each other," she said simply. "Not perfection, but reflection, and a willingness to do better." Silence. Then, one by one, people began to clap. Not for Elena, for Rachel, for the moment they had just witnessed, for the change happening in real time. And Elena knew. This was just the beginning. Elena never set out to change an entire company. She wasn't an activist, nor did she hold a position of power within the airline. She was just a woman who had once been dismissed, quietly ushered to the back of a plane without a second thought. But that single moment, so small, so seemingly inconsequential, became the catalyst for something much larger. It sparked conversations. It made people question their assumptions. And as weeks turned into months, it transformed an entire culture from the inside out. It started with whispers. At first, employees gossiped about the flight. They murmured about the CEO's wife being moved to the back of the plane, about how the attendant responsible, Rachel, had faced a moment of reckoning. Some dismissed it as an overreaction. Others felt a flicker of unease, wondering if they, too, had made similar assumptions about passengers without realizing it. But change doesn't happen through whispers. Change happens when those whispers turn into conversations, real, honest conversations. And that's exactly what began to unfold. Rachel was the first to feel its impact. Once she had been one of the more respected attendants, known for her ability to handle difficult passengers with efficiency. But now she found herself looking at every interaction differently. She couldn't forget the way Elena had looked at her. Not with anger, not even with disappointment, but with a kind of knowing stillness that had made Rachel feel small, not because of what Elena had done, but because of what she had failed to do. For weeks after the flight, Rachel wrestled with that feeling. She couldn't ignore it. Then came the moment that changed everything. One afternoon on a routine flight to Denver, Rachel was serving drinks when she noticed a young woman sitting near the back. The woman was quiet, dressed simply, her hands folded in her lap as she stared out the window. She wasn't causing a scene, wasn't asking for anything. And yet, Rachel felt it, that same flicker of assumption. She almost walked past her, almost dismissed her, but then Rachel stopped. This was her moment. She turned back, stepping toward the young woman. "Excuse me, miss," Rachel said gently. "Is there anything I can get for you? A blanket? A drink?" The woman looked up, startled for a moment, as if she wasn't used to being noticed. Then slowly a small, grateful smile appeared. "Oh, thank you. Just some water would be nice." Rachel felt something shift in her chest as she nodded. A simple moment, but it mattered, and she knew it. From that day on, Rachel became different. She noticed people. She questioned her assumptions before they solidified into decisions. And she wasn't the only one. The story of Elena's flight made its way into training sessions, staff meetings, and leadership discussions. Employees found themselves re-examining their interactions, not just with passengers, but with each other. One senior flight attendant, Mark Reynolds, had been with the airline for nearly 15 years. He had seen every kind of passenger, the difficult, the entitled, the genuinely kind. But something about Elena's story lingered with him. It made him think about a moment he had long buried in the back of his mind. Years ago, he had been on a delayed flight. A woman, elderly, with a worn-out sweater and a nervous expression, had approached him, asking for help adjusting her carry-on bag. He had been tired, irritated, and without much thought, had sighed before begrudgingly helping her. She had thanked him. He had barely acknowledged her. And now, suddenly, he couldn't stop thinking about it. Had she felt like a burden? Had she spent the rest of that flight wondering if she had been an inconvenience? Mark found himself unable to let it go. The next time an elderly passenger boarded his flight, Mark didn't just help her with her bag. He greeted her warmly, made sure she was comfortable, and checked on her during the flight. It wasn't about making up for past mistakes. It was about choosing to do better now. Little by little, these moments began to ripple outward. Gate agents started pausing before brushing off passengers' questions. Baggage handlers began taking extra care with luggage that looked fragile or sentimental. Flight attendants learned to read beyond the surface, to recognize when a passenger was struggling but too polite to ask for help. Elena watched this transformation from a distance. She never asked for credit, never wanted her name to become a symbol. But when she flew, she felt the difference. She saw the way a father traveling alone with two young children was offered assistance before he even had to ask. She saw a teenager who looked anxious about flying receive an extra moment of reassurance from a kind attendant. She saw a woman who looked tired and overlooked finally receive a smile that made her feel seen, and it was enough. Then something unexpected happened. Rachel, who had once been the cause of Elena's flight experience, was now leading inclusion training for new employees. She stood in front of a group of fresh-faced flight attendants, nerves tightening in her stomach, and told them her story. "I was that flight attendant," she admitted, "the one who made an assumption and didn't even think twice about it. And I can tell you right now, I never want to feel that way again." The room was silent. Rachel's eyes scanned the trainees, looking at the eager young professionals who would one day be responsible for the passengers who trusted them. "I want you to learn from my mistake," she continued, "not just because it could cost you your job, but because it matters. Because the way you treat people, this sticks with them, sometimes forever." One of the trainees, a young woman named Hannah, raised her hand. "What happened after?" she asked. "Did you apologize?" Rachel hesitated for a beat, then nodded. "I did," she said. "But the truth is, an apology isn't enough. Actions are what matter." A murmur of understanding moved through the group. Rachel took a slow breath, then smiled. "So let's talk about how we make those actions count." It was in that moment, standing in front of the next generation of airline professionals, that Rachel realized something. She had become part of the change. She had gone from being the person who needed to learn to being the person who could teach. Elena never asked for recognition. She never wanted her experience to be anything more than a lesson in kindness. But as time went on, it became clear. It was more than that. It was a ripple effect. One that was still growing, and one that would last far beyond a single flight. At first, it was just a story on a plane, a quiet moment of dignity that had left an impression on the passengers who witnessed it. But stories don't stay contained when they hold real weight. They spread, they echo. They ripple outward until they reach ears that need to hear them most. And that's exactly what happened with Elena's story. It began with a single social media post. A young woman sitting just a few rows behind Elena that day had been watching. She had seen the way Elena had been ushered to the back of the plane without argument, without a fight. She had seen the silent weight of the moment and how Elena, with nothing but her composure and quiet strength, had shifted the energy of the entire flight. And when she learned who Elena was, she had felt a sting of realization. She had written about it that night, capturing the lessons she had learned in a single powerful post. "I saw something today that made me rethink how I treat people." A woman, poised, elegant, calm, was asked to move to the back of the plane. And she did. No argument. No drama. Just quiet grace. But then, hours later, we all learned the truth. She wasn't just any passenger. She was the wife of the CEO of the airline. She owned the seat she was asked to leave, and she never said a word. She let the flight attendant make her own assumptions. She let the moment teach the lesson. And it did, because I will never again assume I know someone's worth just by looking at them. The post went viral overnight. Thousands shared it, then hundreds of thousands. Soon it had millions of views, appearing on news feeds, in think pieces, on corporate blogs discussing workplace culture and unconscious bias. People weren't just reading it, they were feeling it. It hit deep. because everyone at some point in their life had been on one side of that moment or the other, the one being dismissed or the one doing the dismissing. And the world wasn't just watching Elena's story unfold, they were seeing themselves in it. A movement begins. Soon, conversations erupted across industries. Teachers discussed it in classrooms, using it as an example of how bias forms and how to unlearn it. Companies held diversity and inclusion meetings, encouraging employees to share moments where they had either felt invisible or been the ones making assumptions. Customer service teams began rethinking their approach, reminding themselves that every person they interact with carries a story they cannot see. And airline employees, in particular, felt the impact the hardest. Flight attendants across the world read the story, their faces burning with quiet recognition. They had all had their Rachel moment at days, a time when they had judged too quickly, dismissed too easily, assumed too much. But now something was different. Now they were more aware. One flight attendant, Sarah Duncan, had been working for a major international airline for 7 years. She prided herself on efficiency, on keeping things running smoothly, on making quick decisions that kept flights on schedule. But after reading about Elena, she began to question how often her quick decisions were really just assumptions. And then one day she had her own moment. It was a late-night flight from Los Angeles to Tokyo. The cabin lights were dim. Most passengers were either asleep or quietly watching movies. Then she saw him, an elderly man dressed in a simple jacket and worn-out shoes, sitting quietly in first class. Sarah's first thought, he must have wandered into the wrong seat. She almost walked up to him, almost asked to see his boarding pass. But then, Elena's story flashed in her mind. She hesitated. Instead of assuming, she chose differently. She approached, not with suspicion, but with respect. "Good evening, sir," she said softly. "Is there anything I can get for you?" The man smiled warmly. "Just a cup of tea, if you don't mind." She brought it to him, watching as he sipped it slowly, his expression calm, thoughtful. And later, when she happened to glance at his name on the flight manifest, she felt her stomach drop. He wasn't just any passenger. He was a retired pilot, a legend in the aviation industry, a man who had spent over 40 years flying the very routes she now worked. And she had almost treated him like he didn't belong. She found herself unable to shake the thought. How many times before had she made that same mistake, without realizing it? That night, as she lay in her hotel room after the flight, she made herself a quiet promise. Never again. Meanwhile, as her name spread across news articles and corporate boardrooms, Elena remained unchanged. She wasn't interested in fame. She wasn't looking for recognition. She only wanted one thing, for people to see each other. For people to realize that respect should never be given based on assumptions, but because we all deserve it. When journalists tracked her down asking for interviews, she declined most of them. "The story isn't about me," she said. "It's about all of us." But when one reporter asked her what she hoped people took away from it all, she paused, then said, "That respect isn't about who someone is, it's about who you are." And that was the message that people carried with them. The lesson lingered. It became a quiet challenge in people's hearts. To pause before making a snap judgment. To look deeper before assuming. To remember that every person they meet carries a story they cannot see. The airport terminal was alive with movement, filled with hurried steps, hushed conversations, and the rhythmic beep of boarding announcements. Among the crowd, Elena Carrington stood near the massive glass windows, her reflection merging with the city lights beyond. She had always loved watching the world move, each person carrying their own story, their own struggles, their own quiet victories. But now she knew something with absolute certainty. How you treat people when no one is watching defines who you truly are. This truth had followed her long after that fateful flight, the one where she had been quietly asked to move seats, the one where she had chosen grace over conflict. She had never expected it to turn into something bigger, never imagined that her silence would teach a lesson louder than words ever could. Yet here she was months later, watching the world shift in ways she never thought possible. Change had rippled outward from that single moment. It had started with a story, her story, shared in whispers between passengers, then passed from one conversation to another until it found its way into boardrooms, classrooms, and workplaces across the globe. And now she saw the effects everywhere. The airline Daniel owned, Atlantic Skies, had completely restructured its employee training. They had implemented new programs, not just for flight attendants, but for every department, designed to teach awareness, emotional intelligence, and respect in every interaction. The goal wasn't just better customer service. It was about fostering a culture of dignity and kindness. And it wasn't just the airline. A restaurant owner in New York reached out, sharing how Elena's story had changed the way he trained his staff, reminding them to treat every guest as if they could change the world, because one day one of them might. A teacher in Chicago told her that she had shared the lesson with her students, asking them to reflect on a time they had made an assumption about someone and how it had shaped their perspective. A hospital director in London sent her a message saying their team had restructured patient care protocols, ensuring that every person who walked through their doors was treated with the same level of respect, regardless of background, title, or wealth. One decision, one quiet moment, and now a world of change. But perhaps the most unexpected part, Rachel, the flight attendant who had misjudged her, who had made that split-second assumption and ushered her to the back of the plane, had become one of the biggest advocates for change. Rachel had chosen to learn, not hide. After attending the new training sessions, she volunteered to help lead them. She stood in front of new employees, future flight attendants, and told her story, not to justify but to educate. She was no longer afraid to admit her mistake, because now she understood. Growth isn't about avoiding failure. It's about choosing to rise after it. Rachel's transformation had been one of the most inspiring things Elena had witnessed. The same woman who had once let assumptions cloud her judgment was now standing in front of strangers, sharing the lessons she had learned the hard way, hoping to stop others from making the same mistake. And it worked. Every day, more people joined the movement, not just at the airline, but across different industries, different communities, different lives. Because the truth was clear. Respect is not just for those we think have earned it. It's for everyone. As Elena turned from the window, her eyes met Daniel's. He stood nearby, watching her with the same quiet admiration he had always carried. He didn't need to say anything. She could feel it. He was proud of her. But what mattered even more, she was proud of herself. She had never set out to make a statement. She had never intended to spark conversations that would change the way people saw the world. But sometimes change isn't about what we plan. It's about what we refuse to ignore. And now, standing at the threshold of a new journey, Elena felt something she hadn't in a long time. Hope. She glanced down at the email on her phone, a formal invitation from the airline industry's largest conference. They wanted her to speak to thousands of professionals about the power of respect, leadership, and second chances. She had hesitated at first, but then she realized this wasn't just her story anymore. This was about everyone who had ever been overlooked, everyone who had ever been judged before they had a chance to prove themselves, everyone who had ever been seen as less than because of a uniform, a name, a background, or a single moment of misunderstanding. She had been given a voice, and now it was time to use it. Elena took a deep breath and hit reply. I'd be honored to share this lesson with the world. Elena's story isn't just hers alone. It's a story about how the smallest moments can define us. How we treat the people around us when no one is watching says more about us than any title or achievement ever will. And now it's your turn. Have you ever made an assumption about someone only to realize later that you were wrong? Tell us your story in the comments below. Your words might just inspire someone else, just like Elena's story inspired the world. Hit like if you believe respect should be given freely, not based on appearances or assumptions, but because we all deserve it. Subscribe to this channel for more inspiring real-life stories that remind us change starts with you. Because respect isn't just about what we say, it's about what we do. And today, you get to decide what kind of impact you leave on the world. Are you ready?